Welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for the show. Thanks for all of you who are returning this year. I'm really excited to introduce a new series called The Scholar's Corner. And today we're going to get started. Our first guest, which I'm very excited about because he was talked about so highly by a man that I got to work for just a short while, not long enough. This gentleman is named Dr. Chris Rupe. He's a graduate from State University of New York at Genesco with a degree in biology. After graduating, he felt led by the Lord to start a nonprofit ministry called Back to Genesis. Since his early 20s, he's been speaking on the topic of creation, evolution in various settings. Dr. Rupe had the honor of working closely with genomist Dr. John Sanford, president of Feed My Sheep Foundation, which I had the pleasure of working for just a short while. At FMS, Chris spent several years researching the topic of human evolution and the hominin fossil record. He has studied paleoanthropology in depth, which has required the study of hundreds of technical papers and dozens of related books. Their work is published in a fascinating book called Contested Bones. In addition, Chris has researched a broad range of biological topics ranging from pseudogenes to the origin of life, to bacterial evolution, to fish evolution, to whale evolution, to human evolution, to the famous riddle of Haldane's dilemma. Chris Rupe has published numerous articles on these topics, some of which we will discuss here today. So I'd like to get him out here and let's get started on this great conversation. I almost couldn't find the button. Welcome to the Faith and Culture Show, Scholar's Corner.
Well, thanks. I'm so glad to be here. Really appreciate it.
Well, there's a lot to talk about. I hardly know where to start. You've done a lot. You're very young. And so I'm glad that the Christian community has someone like yourself who has really taken the word to heart and started digging deeply and started put your money where your mouth is, basically in the way of sweat equity of going through graduate school
Yep.
to work towards, just kind of proof. We live in a world where everything needs proof. Scientific proof seems to reign, which is fine with me. So I kind of don't know where to start. I know that when you worked with Dr. Sanford, there's a lot of evidence for a young Earth. And I know I didn't bring this up earlier, but it just came to my mind while we were chatting earlier. And if you want to talk about that, that would be wonderful, because I don't think a lot of people understand the concept of young Earth versus old Earth. And there are, I guess some people have really been alienated on either side because of misunderstandings. So keep that in your mind. I'd like to get to that. And I guess, I have, my first question was, what prompted you to be interested in Earth science? And maybe that would lead into the young Earth, old Earth debate. I'm not sure, but I'll let you talk.
No, surely it does. Because for me, I was born in a Christian home with wonderful parents, very biblically consistent. So there was not any hypocrisy. And that was a privilege. I recognize that. And, but when I was in high school, I began to doubt the Bible. And I thought, well, what if my parents are sincere in their faith, but they're sincerely wrong? What if I was born in a different part of the world where maybe a different religion was popular, or atheism? What if I was born with two parents who both did not believe the Bible? Would I still believe the Bible? I think this is a common question that Christians have if they're growing up in a Christian home, and it's a good question. It's good to have those doubts, but I think the doubts overwhelmed me so much that I thought, well, maybe God doesn't exist. Maybe he's not even the God of the Bible, if he exists at all. And how do I know the Bible is really true? So for me, I didn't want to just follow whatever felt good or whatever was comfortable. Even if that meant rejecting the faith and being an atheist, I was willing to believe whatever was true. And at that point in my life, I got rid of, video games and never picked them up again. Just wanted to do research in the sciences, research and historicity of the Bible, but especially origins, because I can remember going to high school thinking, well, if I'm an evolved ape and there is no God, then why would I follow the straight and narrow like my parents taught me? Why would I follow what Jesus taught me if it's not even true? I'm going to have fun and do whatever I want with my friends. That's kind of how I was thinking. So I
Mm-hmm.
had to know, is the Bible really true? And it mattered because, again, I don't want to live my life for a lie. So that led me on a
Yeah.
quest to do a lot of research, and it led me ultimately to get my degree in biology at a state university in New York, as you mentioned. Then work with Dr. Sanford for 7 years. He was a former atheist, geneticist of Cornell. So he was very serious into investigating this question of origins as well. I at that
Mm-hmm.
point had already reconciled my doubts. I was exposed to creation resources, and really my faith just blossomed during this time period because I could see how the evidence from fossils, genetics, and biology really supports the Bible and Genesis. And then I went on for 7 more years to get my degree, a PhD in geology. And it was in the earth, my PhD is in earth science, but my dissertation was on the Navajo sandstone. And
Mm-hmm.
in particular, it was on carbonates, which is limestone. So I did my dissertation on limestone in the lower Jurassic Navajo sandstone formation. And during that time period of pursuing geology, sedimentary geology, again, my faith was strengthened evermore. So my testimony really is one of going from doubts to much more confident faith, because what I see in creation with the fossils and rock layers really does um, support a biblical view of origins in Genesis.
Which is amazing because every time it seems that a scientist is honest with themselves and looking for the truth, like you are and were at that time, that it always will lead to there has to be a God. There
Yeah.
has to be. Things are too perfect.
Mhm.
And the Bible talks about these things, not like it's a science book, but it just mentions these things in prayers that we, that are said in discussions of where things happened in context. We can
Yeah.
find these things, and this is some of the questioning I wanted to ask you today, because you have really looked into earth science, and I
Mhm.
watched the film that you have, which is wonderful, and we'll have to talk about that so that people will go watch that. um, it makes me wonder, okay, there is different strata in the layers and in the earth, and we know that. And so one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, did you see anything from a difference between the strata that you studied to maybe something that might have happened that was a worldwide flood? How do we
Mhm.
know that 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 part of scripture is true?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the answer to that question for me is a little bit easier than maybe other creationists might think. So you're talking about the flood boundary, like where the flood began. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So for some creationists, that's it's a harder question than others, but for me, there's a pretty simple answer to that. But before I can get there, I have to establish some background. So when we're talking about the stratified layers that you mentioned, we're really talking about sedimentary rocks, and those include things like sandstone, limestone, mudstone. That would include shale. And so those are the water deposited sedimentary layers that are now found high and dry on the continents. So those water deposited layers also contain fossils, fossils of sea creatures, land creatures, and as a biblical creationist, we would say that is the evidence for a global flood. And if there really was a year long global flood, as Genesis 6 through 9 describes, we would expect that at some point in the past, we believe it's about 4,500 years ago, sea levels did rise globally. And when you have global rising sea levels, you're going to transport mass amounts of sediment onto the continents. And today, we do find water deposited sediments that are now, um, on average, about 1 to 3 miles thick on the continents. So, well above sea level in many places. This is incredible. Thousands of feet above sea level, sea creatures buried together with land creatures. So that is the evidence for the flood. And what's unique about these layers is that, unlike most deposits that are forming today, today you might see river deltas. Rivers are dumping sand, silt, and clay. They're forming deltas, and these deltas are represent a certain area of land, but it's generally restricted compared to these blanket layers that are from the flood. Those ones are oftentimes incredibly extensive, in cases expanding across much of North America, and they can be correlated even across the oceans. They're found in what's called mega sequences. So you might find mega sequences are defined as basically having multiple sedimentary rock formations, like packages of rocks, and those laterally extensive layers are in sequences that themselves can be correlated on all the continents. So the deposition is not only thick, it's laterally continuous. Local deposits don't do that. They're much smaller region. So what's happening today is not really indicative of the geology that happened in the past. The flood geology was a unique event, and we can see that.
That's amazing. And I have heard about how odd it is to find sea creatures along with other fossils in the same area in high mountaintops and places
Mhm.
you wouldn't expect it. Do you think now? I don't expect you. You probably know this, but I've always wondered: could this possibly be a sign of maybe like um, things that died off before the flood? In the Bible, it does mention that everything was covered with water, and
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering, how do you know the difference between maybe when the earth was created and what happened during the flood?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And this goes back to defining that boundary between, where does the flood start and where was the pre-flood rocks. And and that background is helpful because when I'm explaining these blanket layers of water deposited rocks on the continents, they have rich fossil content in them. In mudstone, sandstone, limestone, there's lots of fossil content. But today, we typically don't see fossils forming. You can have millions of wildebeest uh, be caught up in rivers, and they can be even buried with sediment, but they're not forming fossils. Today, you're not seeing that process happening on a large scale at all. And so the question is, what do you need to form fossils? Well, the flood does create the conditions necessary to form fossils, because if you do a study in taphonomy, this is a subfield of paleontology. It has to do with everything that happens to an organism after death to the point of final fossilization or non-fossilization, just decomposed and being scavenged and being gone. So it explains the bias in the fossil record. Why are some things preserved and some not? Well, in taphonomy, and if you look at the scientific journals, the evolutionary based literature, they'll acknowledge to form fossils, the guiding rule, the predominant mechanism is rapid burial of sediments. So the flood model does predict not only would you have water deposited rock layers high and dry, thousands of feet above sea level, you would
Mhm.
also expect to find fossils because rapid burial would be happening all over the place as sediments are being brought onto the continents, burying entire ecosystems, transporting them, jumbling them, sorting them as well. It's a complex process, but fossils should remind us really of a global flood and God's judgment. You need unique conditions to form fossils. So so the question then is, okay, if you would have fossils forming during the flood, why not before the flood? Well, you might in rare instances, in some circumstances for sure, like landslides and things like that, that are also resulting in rapid burial. But in general, before the flood, I don't think we're going to find evidence of, these laterally extensive layers covering all the continents with fossils in them. That was formed during the flood.
Mm.
So before the flood, you have more or less processes that are going on today. Rivers, shallow marine shelves, even continental seas. So you'd have depositional environments similar to what we see today. But during the flood, you have very different process, in terms of scale, especially. So
Okay.
all that to say, I would say the flood boundary is where that point is where suddenly you don't see any more laterally extensive sedimentary rock layers with fossils in them. Those mega sequences, I think, represent the totality of the flood sediments, and that is basically approximately around the Cambrian, maybe a little lower into the Precambrian, all the way to creationists debate it, but I would say it's where those extensive rock layers pretty much stop, and then above that, that would be in the Cenozoic. And then above that, you have normal deposition going on, localized deposits, and so I would say it's at that boundary where you go from laterally extensive, more of a global scale phenomenon, to localized deposits.
Okay. So when you started uh, doing this and you were found yourself interested in earth science, were you looking for anything specific?
So at this point, I was committed to the biblical perspective, but I wanted to understand the evolutionary or secular conventional model. I wanted to understand, how they think. And because I up until that point I had learned from creation resources, and I wanted to dive more into the secular literature. And
Hmm.
so in our courses we used all of these mainstream textbooks, coming from the standard model perspective of millions of years, geologic timescale, radioisotope dating methods, as the basis. And that was really helpful because I just wanted to have further clarity on making sure I understand their models and how they think. And that clarity was, what I learned from creations was pretty much confirmed. So the secular model thinks in terms of paleo environments. Now, it's a technical term. A paleo environment is simply where today, again, we have examples of river deltas, alluvial fans, shallow marine shelves. We have lakes. We have different depositional environments today. And from a long age perspective, they believe we've always had those same types of environments. And so whenever they come to a massive formation like what I study, the Navajo sandstone, they'll
Hmm.
always interpret it in light of this paleo environments paradigm. They'll say, okay, what ancient environment formed this deposit? Was it a river? Was it a lake? Was it maybe even a period of rising sea level? So they're always thinking in terms of that mindset.
Okay.
And that's why they can't see the evidence for a flood. Because when I see these rock layers covering the continents, spanning multiple continents, I say, well, that's obviously the flood evidence.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they'll zoom into it and say, well, no, this must have been formed by a river. The problem is, though, with that model is those deposits that you see today of rivers look nothing like the deposits we see in the rock record. The ones we see in the rock record, they're extensive and they're uniform composition, texture oftentimes, and continuing for hundreds of miles in cases, hundreds of square miles. So the scale is nothing like it. And there's other features too that indicate this is not like localized deposits. So what we're seeing is really different.
Okay. And I understand that. I think that happens in any science really, biological or cosmological or or astrophysicist. If you're set on not focusing on the fact that there could be intelligent design and you're just having blinders on like a horse in a race or something, you're never going to consider anything else except what you see right in front of you, and you're going to miss it. You're going to miss
Yes.
what really happened because you have a
Yes.
preconceived idea.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So what I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but was there anything that really surprised you during your research?
Yeah, for sure. So I can remember going on a number of field trips, including the research I did for my own dissertation. I'd spent a lot of time out in the field. And one thing that struck me going through all these sedimentary rock formations in different states was a theme that creationists had talked about in their many books. And what I found is that creation claim is really valid. So what am I talking about here? Well, what we're taught typically is that in standard geology thinking is that all of these geologic formations show evidence for the most part of slow and gradual deposition, where, for example, you look at limestone. It's typically interpreted as being deposited through gravitational settling, microscopic particles settling at the bottom of an ancient sea or marine shelf, and it's very this very calm environment, and so they typically see rates of accumulation being very gradual over time, millimeters per year, even at a time. And when I went into the field, though, I can remember reading things from Derek Agger, who is a former president of the British Geological Association. He was actually an anti-creationist, but he was one of the most well-traveled geologists. So he went to like 57 different countries studying sedimentary rock formations all over the place. And he wrote a couple of books, and his books were basically saying catastrophism has returned. Now, what do I mean by that? He's saying that, look, there was a debate around the 1800s where there were these people who were believing in a global flood or catastrophes. And in that model, you would assume that the rates of deposition were greatly accelerated in the past. And so this catastrophist perspective is really has become adopted as a biblical position where we believe in catastrophism, a global flood greatly increasing the rates of erosion and deposition. And Derek Agger, actually, as an anti-creationist, wrote an entire book, 2 books, describing formation after formation, showing evidence of not slow and gradual deposition, but rapid deposition.
Mhm.
And he used all kinds of language that creationists would use. And so that was fascinating to me. But then when I went into the field, I saw it with my own eyes. And I was like, okay, every formation that I look at, all these sedimentary formations, they're showing evidence after evidence of moving currents, fast moving currents, sudden deposition, things that are not characteristic of the millions of years model that we hear about everywhere. So seeing is sometimes believing, and it really helped to confirm the catastrophist interpretation, biblical flood
When
model, really.
Yeah, when this scientist who who you worked with, which was awesome. You did work with him, right?
Yes, I
You got
did
to
for seven
travel.
years.
Okay. Okay, so when he saw this coming approaching his conclusions as a non-creationist, he looks at this. Did he by any chance, I guess, change his mind about how old the earth is by looking at this and studying the rocks and the
Yeah, so
layers?
it's a good question. So Dr. Sanford's journey is a little different than mine. He actually started out as you know, as a very zealous evolutionary scientist for much of his adult life,
Yeah.
and
No,
then he.
not Dr. Sanford, the other
Oh,
one that you just
oh, I'm
mentioned.
sorry, I misunderstood you. Yeah, so
Okay.
he never came to faith, and
Okay.
he seemed to remain hostile towards the biblical creation perspective to the point of his death, sadly.
Oh,
But the point is, though, is that his observations from the field
yeah.
in his books were explicitly describing what he described as rapid evidence of rapid deposition, and processes that creationists would welcome.
Yeah.
So yeah, so unfortunately, he didn't come to grips with that, but I think he saw at least 2 things that we agree in common. That is the size of these ancient sedimentary rock formations are enormous. And he went on for quite at length talking about just the size of them. How can they cover, vast areas of continents and be correlated across the oceans onto other continents? Nothing like that is happening today. So he commented
Mm,
on the size of the deposits as well as the nature of how they show evidence internally, that the sedimentary formations show evidence of rapid deposition. So so he's saying there's evidence of global deposition and rapid deposition.
right.
We agree as creationists. I just think it was recent as well, based on other evidence we could talk about.
Right. Okay. What other evidence would you like to
Yeah.
talk about that?
Yeah, so those are the 3 evidences for the flood that I oftentimes present on. It's just remember GER. It's kind of corny, but it's GER. So global, rapid, and recent. I just discussed how the global nature of the sedimentary record, and how they're vast. I also mentioned how there's evidence of rapid deposition. I can give examples of that, but there's also evidence of recent deposition. that all these, what creationists say are the flood deposited rock layers, they show evidence of being deposited recently, just thousands of years ago, consistent with a biblical timeline. And one evidence I could cite is carbon 14. That's typically used as an evidence against creation, but actually, uh, carbon 14 dating is a creationist's best friend. So I can unpack that more if you'd like. So
Sure.
carbon
Go ahead.
14, okay, so carbon 14 dating is based on carbon 14, which is a radioactive isotope, and it
Mm-hmm.
decays into nitrogen 14, which is stable. And carbon 14 has a half-life of about 5,730 years. Students learn this in earth science in middle school and high school.
Mm-hmm.
And so carbon 14 has a very short half-life, such that, according to scientific papers, their best AMS, it's called, uh, basically their sophisticated equipment that measures individual carbon 14 atoms. They can't give dates past 100,000 years. That's because of the short half-life. So these accelerator mass spectrometers, AMS labs, they know there's a theoretical limit. Anything older than 100,000 years, some actually say 50,000 or 70,000, anything older than that, they simply won't carbon date because there's no reason to. They assume there's no carbon 14 left in it. So imagine dinosaur fossils. According to the standard model, dinosaurs are at least 65 million years old.
Right.
So from the Mesozoic. And if they're that old, should they have any carbon 14 left in them? The answer is no. They should be carbon 14 dead. It should completely have converted into nitrogen 14. Yet, in the radiocarbon literature, when they're testing their instruments and trying to figure out different anomalies, what they have found in over 90 separate peer-reviewed scientific journals, not creation journals, evolution-based radiocarbon journals, they're showing measurable amounts of carbon 14 in once living things that are throughout the entire sedimentary record, from top to bottom. That includes dinosaurs, you name it. Um, in fact, creationists have done their own research and have validated that. We've also found carbon 14 in dinosaur fossils as well. Some scientists even reported on this in a secular meeting, and their abstract was rescinded. But it was not because of the scientific rigor. It was because
Mm-hmm.
of the implications it posed for the evolutionary time frame. They understood that, look, you shouldn't find any carbon 14 in things like dinosaur fossils, coal that's supposedly 300 million years old, even diamonds. Diamonds are believed to be Earth's hardest mineral, about 1 to
Right.
4 billion years old. So they're very resilient to contamination. Yet, in every case that have been measured, that have been sent to these labs, diamonds also have carbon 14 in them. And Dr. John Baumgartner, he's a geophysicist, he's a creationist. He worked at the prestigious Los Alamos National Laboratory. He actually says probably more than anyone in the world. And his conclusion is this suggests the entire physical age of the Earth must be young. You can't have carbon 14 throughout the entire sedimentary record and have it be an old Earth. It's just not possible. You have
That
to assume that every single sample that's ever been sent in is contaminated without any exception, which is absurd.
Wow. Now, what does that do? My hesitation with this argument with carbon 14 dating is uh, testing for, but now that you explain it like this, I think I can understand it's okay that dating the manuscripts that we
Mhm.
have of scripture and
Yep.
and understanding that. But if you say it has a half-life of 5,000 something years, 5,400
Yep.
or okay. And
730. Yep.
so obviously any manuscripts that we have are 2,000 years old. They're not going to be
Mhm.
5,000 years old. So
Right. I would say
that
they can't
doesn't
be older. That's right. They can't be older from a biblical point of view. They can't be older than the time of the flood, 4,500
okay.
years ago, because the pre-flood
Right.
world was destroyed.
Right. Now
Right.
we have there there is evidence of, of obviously there were big civilizations going on before
Mhm.
the flood. You've got Gobekli Tepe, I think, is an area that I've done some research on. That's what I was doing some research for Dr. Sanford myself, looking back in the pagan, how the pagans acted and the way they lived and what they did. And so I did some antediluvian research, and that amazes me that anything even exists from back then, but it does, which is wonderful for research because it gives us an understanding of how paganism and demonic activity have gone on forever. So,
Mhm.
but
Yeah.
I always wondered about that too.
So the ancient civilizations, um, those if they're based on carbon dating,
Hmm.
you have to understand too something important that has been recognized um, by many people who've studied this. The carbon 14 dates actually need to be corrected past a certain point. And what we see is as you get closer to the flood, even you can even show support for this outside of creationists. The dates seem to diverge from archaeology. So you have to apply a correction factor because past I forgot the exact time frame, around 3,500 years. I forgot, double check that. But the
Okay.
dates from carbon dating don't line up with archaeology. So they have to correct for it. And it
Okay.
diverges further and further away from as you get closer to the flood. And according to the biblical model, we would expect this as well because during the flood, there are two issues going on that affect carbon 14 dates. One is Earth's magnetic field. Earth's magnetic field is decaying. That's, everyone would agree with that. Empirical data is indicating over a historical time period, the magnetic field is decaying over time. Well, the magnetic field actually shields these cosmic rays so that it produces less carbon 14. So in the past, if Earth's magnetic field was stronger, that means you have less carbon 14 being produced in Earth's upper atmosphere. Now, in addition, you also have a global flood with vast deposits of coal. These coal seams are, once living remains of plants. And we can tell from the amount of coal, which is compacted down from great size, that the pre flood world was much greener. There was way more biomass, which means there was a lot more carbon 12 relative to carbon 14.
Mm.
So when you have that a correction factor, it does put these dates neatly within a biblical time frame. You can correct for the carbon 14 dates of dinosaurs that suggest they're 40,000 years old based on the amount of carbon 14 in them, and even archaeology. And so you have to calibrate things, you have to correct things. You can't just do it based on the assumption of carbon 14, carbon 12 ratios being the same throughout all of time. That would be bad science. So
Yeah.
yeah. So those civilizations that you hear about, um,
Yes.
you have to question those dates. And I think the evidence from archaeology and the reliable carbon 14 dates indicate you won't find civilizations older than 4,500 years old. And any of
Okay.
those civilizations would have been destroyed in the flood. Because remember, we have a mile and a half. I don't know if I said this, but about a mile, 1 to 3 miles on average. Think about that of sedimentary rocks on the continents. So if you're a Christian, think of the Garden of Eden. Where would it be? We don't know. It'd be buried. If it
Mhm.
wasn't protected by God and preserved for, a later point, it was completely destroyed, completely buried. And so we don't have any knowledge of where things were in the pre-flood world. Even the pyramids today, the pyramids are built on a huge pile of sedimentary rocks, which themselves were deposited during the flood. So the pyramids weren't built below those, they're found on top of them. So that gives you the order. The flood first, then Egypt was built after the flood.
Mhm. Wow. Okay, that gives a lot of food for thought.
Yes.
Um, a lot of food for thought. Okay, so we are talking about the flood and talked about the how what research has there been done about the entire world being covered, because there has been, there have been some people say, well, it was just a regional flood,
Right.
and then others that say no, it's showing that it was a global flood, and you're saying that it looks like it's a global flood because you said that this sedimentary rock covers continents.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that
And
correct?
that's
Okay.
correct. I mean, there's no way to explain the global scale of these sedimentary rock formations except if you assume global rising sea levels. Even evolutionists understand that, and they have to invoke a period of 6 near global transgressions. Transgressions mean periods when sea levels rising globally. They have to invoke that as well. So we have a simple model for it, though. We have just one global flood. They have to invoke several instances of global rising sea levels. So there's no mechanism that can do that except a global flood. And the old Earth perspective, what I have found is that all these old Earth perspectives, whether it's the day age theory, that would include the modern version of that, which is founded by Dr. Hugh Ross from Reasons to Believe,
Hmm.
whether it's the gap theory, the framework hypothesis, theistic evolution, William Lane Craig's model, it doesn't matter. Whatever the old Earth model is, all of those views did none of those views existed until the 1800s. And
Hmm.
some of them are modern versions that borrowed from earlier ones, like the day age theory, like Hugh Ross. So none of those theories existed before the 1800s. Now, what happened in the 1800s then? Well, that was when you had people like Charles Lyell and James Hutton, the founding fathers of modern geology. And at that time in history, they were challenging the catastrophist perspective and the scriptural geologists who, previous to that, they believed in a global flood, as scripture indicates. Scripture says all the high hills under the whole heavens were covered with water. And God had to bring to the ark two of every kind of bird. But if it was a local flood, why build this huge ark for animals that can fly, or you could just move to higher ground? If you had 120 years of preaching repentance before the flood, that's plenty of time to move to higher ground. So
Hmm.
it makes no sense to believe in a local flood, except that they're getting those ideas really from secular geology. They're convinced by the millions of years, and they realize you can't believe in both a global flood and millions of years at the same time. In fact, it's hard to think about that, but there's a reason why all of those old Earth theories, every one of them embrace not only an old Earth, of course, that's their purpose, but they also believe in a local flood. It's because the moment you have a global flood, you have to believe it would have destroyed the evidence for millions of years, remixed the sediment, and redeposited it recently. Therefore, the very evidence for millions of years would be destroyed by a recent global flood, and the evidence instead would indicate recent deposition. So that's why every single one of those old Earth models rejects a global flood.
Wow. I never thought of
Yep.
that.
And it gets worse because they accept the secular dating methods, they also have to believe that there were ape men before Adam and Eve. And every single one of those views embraces ape men like Homo neanderthalensis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, you name it, Australopithecus afarensis, all of these ape-like creatures, according to these Christian older theories, lived before Adam and Eve, even millions of years before Adam and Eve. But that's not biblical, and I would say it's also bad science. And it really just borrows from the evolutionary worldview.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And okay. Well, we'll get to contested bones in a minute.
Okay.
That's where I used to love going to Dr. Sanford's um, talks when we were happened to be talking in the same place at the same time. I would
Yeah.
make sure I marked his that I would go because it's just there's just so much scientific proof of just this. We came from two people, and anyway, we'll get to that in a
Yes.
minute.
It's
Um,
fascinating.
yeah, I think so too. Okay, so when you were doing research, you said you found mixed fossils. You found ocean creatures alongside land creatures. Did you yourself find those, or
So
did
for where
other
I was
people,
doing
or is that what
research,
you studied?
no. So for me, I was studying a deposit in the Navajo sandstone. So the Navajo sandstone, if you're not familiar, it's a famous formation because you can find it in Moab, Utah, and at Arches National Park, or you can go to Zion National Park. It crops out in four different states, actually more than that when you consider its lateral equivalents. But Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and it's believed to originally be around 800,000 square miles. So this is a
Wow.
huge deposit on the size of like the Sahara Desert. And in this paleo environments framework, they interpret it as being a wind-blown desert. And in this evolutionary mindset, they think that it was just this vast desert. In Zion, the thickness of the sedimentary of this formation is as thick as 2,000 feet thick. That's
Mm,
incredibly thick. That's a huge deposit. So they think it
yeah.
was this ancient sand sea, like the Sahara, with migrating dunes. And they also, though, they find something interesting. They find limestone in it, though, and limestone is typically deposited in a marine environment or a freshwater environment. So how do they reconcile that? Well, they think, well, maybe this desert had interdune ponds, interdune lakes. And so I focused on the limestone that is interpreted according to the paleoenvironment's paradigm as being an ancient lake in the middle of a desert. But the research that I did is in a very technical, large dissertation volume. In a nutshell, shows that this could not have been deposited in an interdune depositional environment. In fact, the lime mud could not have formed from wind blowing the sand in it. It had to have been deposited through moving currents. And one evidence I cite for that is that the grain size in them is too large, too coarse. It's too large for wind to move it, either by saltation or by suspension, or whatever the mechanism is of wind deposition. When you account for the physics of it, it can't be deposited by wind. It's not strong enough. But water currents are much stronger. And so I find additional evidence in that deposit of water deposition. So the long story short, we're seeing that the lime mud in it, the limestone, was deposited during from fast moving currents. And I did additional research on the sandstone, that it's, the context is sandstone. And this sandstone, I've done flume experiments, me and my colleague. And what we did is we showed that we can reproduce the same structures in the Navajo sandstone in water running through a flume. Now, a flume is pictured as plexiglass or glass. It's like a large aquarium. And what you do is you put sediment into the flume, and water is running through the flume, and it actually causes deposition. And the structures that it forms, the cross bedding that it forms, is very similar to what we see in the Navajo sandstone. And I could go into more detail if you want, but we'll stop there.
Okay. I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so this, I mean, just from learning from what you've looked at, what you've studied, what you've um, done experiments with, you you get a really good sense of what a worldwide flood would do.
Yes.
And we're told in scripture that it began to rain, um, but you're also saying that water came up from beneath.
Yep. Yep. And that's
Okay.
true. Such an important point, because we typically imagine the flood as being almost like a cute little Bible story, and we simplify it so much that we forget what the text actually says. And we see these tiny little sizes of the ark, and we think it was just 40 days and 40 nights of rain. But
Hmm.
actually, if you read the account in Genesis, you can see it records when Noah boarded the ark and when he came off the ark, exact month even and day. And it shows you that he was on the ark for about a year. So it was a year-long flood, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but there were also fountains of the great deep. And Genesis 7:11 records that specifically, saying all the fountains on that day they entered the ark, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And this is speaking of really a crustal rupturing, a tectonic event. So it wasn't a calm, placid flood. It was a catastrophic event, tectonic event.
Mm,
And we do find evidence of the crust of the earth rupturing globally. If you were to look at just Google satellite maps of the ocean basin, imagine having all the water drained out. You can see the ocean basin's surface structure, and it shows these large ridges. And these ridges are basically like areas of the crust of the ocean that split open, and it looks like a baseball stitching. It goes throughout the entire globe, in the middle of
mm,
the oceans, goes all around the
mhm.
oceans.
Yeah.
And that is where creationists believe the fountains of the great deep ruptured and broke open. And by the way, I'll add this real briefly. The whole idea of Pangea and the continents breaking apart did not start with millions of years. It started with a creationist, Antonio Snyder. This is in about the time Darwin published his Origin of Species, and Antonio Snyder was a creationist. He read Genesis chapter 7:11, the fountains of the
Hmm.
great deep. He also noted that how the continents appear to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. He
Yeah.
put two to two in together, and he interpreted that as happening not over millions of years, but catastrophically initiated by the flood. Initiated by the flood. So instead of continental drift, he thought it was more like continental sprint. And modern day
Mm.
creationists embrace that. You can talk to Dr. John Baumgartner. He has a catastrophic plate tectonics model. So creationists who are geologists do understand how tectonics and all these different geologic processes really work marvelously together to explain the biblical flood.
I'm writing down Dr. Baumgardner, John
Yep,
Bog. Okay.
Dr. John
Okay.
Baumgartner.
Um, I was going to ask you that if it was that catastrophic and that forceful from the ground, if this is when the continents started to spread apart from each other, and you just kind of answered that.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people wonder about that. It seems like that would kind of happen with the massive earthquake after the Tower of Babel, but the stage was already set. It sounds like from what you're telling me, with the continents already drifted, for them to be spread all over the world as their languages changed.
Right. So you're thinking of the days of Peleg verse where it says the earth was divided in the days of Peleg. That was a few generations after the flood. And so at that point, the continents are already separated due to
Okay.
during the flood, that was when it would have been catastrophically ruptured and separated. So that by that point, yeah, the earth would be divided, quite literally.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And all right. Um, yeah, that's so interesting. All right. Let's see. Well, what I wanted to ask you in your expertise, what what should people know about how the science records match with the Bible according to your
Yeah.
research?
Yeah, well, it's hard to address that without focusing on the dating methods. That's a really big hang up. I mentioned carbon-14 dating. I'll mention one other radioisotope dating method that's very popular. It was historically very important for establishing the so-called absolute ages of the geologic timescale, and that was based on potassium argon dating or argon argon dating.
Mm-hmm.
It's technical, but I can give a brief example of how this works. And it
Okay.
also is relevant to the seafloor spreading. Their idea of continental drift happening slowly and gradually. They date the new seafloor that forms as magma rises and from these ridges, and it forms new ocean basin, new ocean floor. That's basalt, and that can be dated using potassium argon. So they think they can date this happening gradually, slowly over time. You can see images on Google of the age pattern they'll show you. Kind of looks like zebra pattern. That's also has to do with paleomagnetics. But anyway, let's focus on it simply here. So potassium argon dating, how does it work? So imagine coming to, say, a lava flow, and let's say it's in Hawaii. And in Hawaii, we have this lava flow. We know how old the rock is. How do we know? Because we saw it crystallize. We saw the lava turn to basalt, that
Mm-hmm.
dark rock you can find. So therefore, we have an age of the rock based on history. Now, the way the method works is this: it has an initial amount of potassium and argon. Now, argon is the is the um is the daughter product, and potassium is the parent product. So what happens is the potassium decays into argon, and it's believed that this half life is really long, like 1.25 billion years is the half life. So here's how it works. When they come to a rock, they assume that the argon, which is a noble gas, which means it's a slippery molecule, this noble gas, they believe, should have escaped when it was still lava because it's liquid and it's a gas. So they think all the argon will escape. Well, the problem is if this cools rapidly, and even from ash, for example, from volcanoes, it congeals so rapidly, it actually locks in small amounts of argon, sometimes lots of argon. But they assume with their dating method that all the argon has fully degassed. When in
Okay.
reality, we know that's not true, which is one of the core assumptions of that method. Because when we use it on rocks of known age, like from Hawaii, or let's say from New Zealand lava flows in a mountain that happened in 1975, when we take those samples today and date them with this method, it gives dates of millions of years. confirming the argon that you're measuring didn't come from radioactive decay of the parent, like as necessary to assume it's millions of years old. Instead, it's excess argon that's trapped in the system when it crystallizes, giving the appearance of great age, giving the appearance of being millions of years old. So I hope that's helpful. And there's a number of peer-reviewed sources that are showing this problem of excess argon, giving dates of millions of years for eruptions of recent time frame, 1,000 years old, 100 years old. From Hawaii, different places, Italy. We're seeing these rocks forming recently in recorded history. Yeah, it's giving dates of millions of years. Here's the point: if you
Okay.
can't trust it on rocks of known age, when we're there to test it, its accuracy, how can you test it on rocks? How can you trust it on rocks of unknown age when you weren't there, like millions of
Yeah.
years ago?
Now, I'm asking as a very inquisitive person who
Yep.
enjoys science, because this lava comes from deep in the ground, could it be there's a possibility, and I don't know because unfortunately I'm not a scientist.
Mhm.
Could this be dating the rock or the lava coming from deep in
Yes.
the earth?
It's an excellent question, and the reason why is because argon in the mantle is dramatically higher in proportion than it is in the atmosphere. So there's far more argon in the mantle. In other words, beneath the crust, and even in these, you would presume in these magma chambers that are traveling up the volcanic neck. There's a lot more argon gas in those sources of magma. So we do have a source for all that argon. And you don't need a lot of argon to give dates for millions of years. Even trace amounts, you can get millions of years. So yes, we have an explanation for why these dates are giving millions of years, even though they're forming recently. So that really challenges, in a very profound way, the age of the Earth and the geologic timescale. I agree with the rock layers and the order, but I disagree with the radioisotope dates that are assigned to those layers. And again, as I
Okay.
mentioned, we also have carbon 14, remember. So carbon 14 is showing everything is young. We also have these potassium argon dates that are flawed. And so that's the more complete picture here, why things are so complex.
So we're having a hard time developing a tool to actually measure the dates, the proper dates, or the dating of the earth. Is that what you're saying,
Yes,
basically?
there is a
Mhm.
serious problem with, here's why. When you date something, you can actually measure the concentration of isotopes today using good science, using
Mhm.
sophisticated equipment like I mentioned before, like the accelerator mass spectrometer, the AMS labs. They measure individual carbon 14 atoms with incredible precision. And it's good applied science. It's good science, good technology. But to get an age, you have to use formulas. And those formulas require you to understand what the initial isotope concentrations were millions of years ago. But if you weren't there millions of years ago to measure the isotope concentrations, how do you know? Well, you have to work backwards from present day observations and present day measurements. And that involves a whole bunch of assumptions like the ones I mentioned. You're assuming the argon gas was not there to begin with, or if there is, you think you can correct it with a correction factor that is accurately known. I could speak for probably 2 hours about all the different assumptions and complications and challenges with trying to figure out what those initial concentrations were. So it's a combination of good empirical science measuring it today, but also involves presuppositions, uh, past rates and conditions. So it's not a hard science when you use dating methods. It involves really worldview presuppositions.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Um, the same thing happens in biology too. So
Oh yeah,
we're still learning as, just as a race, as humanity. Um, we're trying to do our best, but
mhm,
there are flaws um,
absolutely.
in the way we are trying to figure things out.
Mhm.
Um, so we did talk about the layers of the flood. So okay, so the going back to, you worked alongside Dr. Sanford on contested bones.
Mhm.
Can you give us an idea of how you went about working on this project that turned out to be a book. And I have a book cover here for people to see so that you can go to backtogenesis.org and purchase a copy. So,
Yes. Well, thanks for the plug. I appreciate it. So Contested Bones was the first edition was published in 2017 and then later updated in 2019. But really we began it, I would say, as early as 2013. This was when I was working with Dr. Sanford, and I really did a deep dive of the scientific literature on all these very famous missing links, some of which we know, like Lucy, Neanderthals, Homo erectus. And I studied it every day, full time, for several years. And what we found was pretty incredible because I didn't know what to expect. I mean, I was not too familiar with these. I just knew the popular creation arguments, but I had never done a much deeper dive into the scientific literature. Um, and having the opportunity to do it full time was a blessing. And so the
yeah,
pattern that emerged from this research didn't come from Christians, it came from their own literature. And there is a pattern in the fossil record, the hominid fossil record, as they call it, where what we're seeing are two different types in general. There's the ape type and there's the human type. The ape type is called Australopithecus, according to evolutionists. That's a genus name,
yeah,
even means southern ape. And then we have the human type, Homo. That's the human genus Homo. So that pattern is in the fossil record. And the most remarkable thing about this is we're seeing a pattern of coexistence. And what I mean by that, I mean that at some point in evolution's past, there was a time when humans did not exist. This was when humans did not yet evolve. So, of course, we weren't around. How could we form fossils? And that point is around 2.5 to 2.8 million years ago. So, anything older than that, you don't really have humans in the sense of humans that are looking more like us. They start to look different, and they start to look more supposedly more like apes, Australopithecus. The problem this though is this: we find even as old as 3.7 million years old, we find human fossils, human footprints, all kinds of skeletal features that indicate these were true humans. Yet they're dating older than the human genus. According to evolution, that's impossible.
yeah,
That's like saying you can be born before your grandparents.
yeah,
Now, the biblical explanation makes perfect sense, though. We would say, well, the reason why those bones look human is simply because they are human, and humans and apes have always coexisted, and we find that in the fossil record. So we
which
we
is
spend a lot of time unpacking that in the book.
that's awesome. So I would suggest everybody go out and get a copy of Contested Bones and take a look at that. Also, Dr. Sanford has genetic entropy, which is, I think that's also on your site. Is that on your
That's correct.
site? Yeah.
Both books are
Um,
available on my website.
yeah, which is a great book, really, to have as a Christian. You should be aware of how our bodies are just kind of like, we're not as robust as the first two. And then, of course, we know everything spread out from Noah and his clan after the flood. So,
Mhm.
but you can look at the human genome way back. So, is there anything else of great importance that you feel like everybody should know real quick? Because I know we've kind of run out of time, but
Yeah,
this is so fascinating. I kind of
yeah.
lost track of time myself. But
Two things that I would mention briefly are one thing we found that really dovetailed with genetic entropy was in contested bones. We found that these so-called um, ape-like creatures, really, if they have Homo in front of it, most of the time we can say these are full human. Um, and when scientists sequenced the genomes of Neanderthals, they found two things. One, their genome is human, and our ancestors interbred with them, which according to the biological species concept, we should now call them the same species, as some evolutionists today argue. So we would say we found one, Neanderthals are fully human, and this makes sense biblically. They're found above the flood sediments. So this is after the flood. This is, I believe it's sometime after the Tower of Babel. They lived during the post-flood ice age period. We can infer that for good reasons. So Neanderthals were not subhuman. They were fully human, one of us. Creationists have said this for years, even
mhm.
before sequencing their genome, because their skeletal anatomy looks so human. That's the first point. The second point is we find evidence from their genome, from these 13 whole genome sequenced from 13 Neanderthal individuals, that they were severely inbred. And this really fits with genetic entropy because when you're severely inbred due to living in reproductive isolation, you tend to fix in the population harmful mutations. And these
Mm,
harmful mutations bring down the fitness. And so in the paper, one paper, they say Neanderthals had 40% less fitness than humans today. So they were not evolved. They were really an isolated people group that were suffering from the effects of inbreeding, and they were fully human. The other point that I wanted to bring out was Adam and Eve. We also find evidence that based on, I'll just briefly, I apologize, based on Y chromosomes, which are passed on paternally through
mhm,
the man, through the sperm,
mhm.
and all humans go back to a single paternal ancestor. Evolutionists nicknamed him Y chromosome Adam.
Yeah.
Now, similar situation with the mitochondrial chromosome, which is only passed on through the mother's egg with no contribution from the father. And evolutionary geneticists found that all humans go back to a single mother of us all. They've nicknamed her mitochondrial Eve.
Imagine that.
And what's that?
Imagine that.
Imagine that. It's tongue in cheek. They don't believe it's a biblical Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
But I want to encourage people to take a look at Dr. Sanford's research and his findings, and also Dismantled, a documentary on our website, backtogenesis.org. We have scene 4 interviewing Dr. John Sanford and Dr. Rob
Yes.
Carter, talking about how this data, this evidence really does support a biblical model. It's not the out of Africa model, it's the out of Middle East model. And we all go back to two people, a genetic Adam and an Eve. And that is remarkable because mutation rates show they go back to, according to mutation rates, they go back to about 6,000 years ago using what's called the pedigree based mutation rates. So that's just a little bit of food for thought for our audience to overwhelm them, that just for the point to show, look, there is so much evidence that supports the biblical model that I
Yeah.
could talk for probably another 3 or 4 hours easily,
Me
and
too.
beyond.
And
Yeah.
listen. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Now, I know that Dr. Rupa is available for going to churches and to functions, seminars. Uh, you, I think you have that mentioned on your website. So if anyone's interested in having him come talk and speak to your group, which would be a really good kind of weekend seminar for people, a lot of learning there, interesting scientific research that we don't hear every day. But
Yes.
we need to know. We really do, to help those around us who just can't take that step of starting to understand anything about the Christian faith. So,
Amen. It's so important because we're taught around the world that we're evolved apes, and that there's
mhm,
really no meaning and purpose to life if you think about it, except to pass on our DNA. But that's a
right.
lie. We were created by a loving God. He created us on purpose. He created us for a purpose. And the sad reality is that we are descendants of Adam and Eve, and they sinned. And as a result, we live in a fallen creation. Our sins have separated us from God. We don't have a relationship with Him. And the way that that was restored was through Jesus Christ, a
Yeah,
descendant of Adam and Eve, right? Who came down from heaven, really, uh, and paid the sacrifice for our sins. He became um, our sacrifice. He died in our place on the cross and said, I'll take the sins of the whole world upon myself so you don't have to bear it, so that you could be forgiven and have eternal life. So that's why I do this. I do this because I want people to know the biblical view in Genesis has real credibility. It's real
yeah,
history. If we came from Adam and Eve, that means we really do need a savior. We're not evolved apes. We're created by God. He loves you, but you have to acknowledge that Jesus is Lord. He loves you. He wants to know you. Will you give up your sin for him? Will you forsake everything and say, Lord, I trust in you. Help me to believe in you. If you do that, your life will never be the same. And
that's
that
right.
happened to me in my life.
It'll be better.
Yeah.
It is
Amen.
better. All
Amen.
right. Well, what a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I really encourage everyone, go check out backtogenesis.org.
Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Catherine. Appreciate it.
God bless you. Thank you.
God bless.